Nicolai Thompson. We're in the final leg of today's program here, looking at Dr. King's speech about the war in Vietnam. Attorney Bill Noss has been my guest. We're deconstructing the speech in view of the fact that on Monday is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, an annual federal holiday that recognizes the life of the slain civil rights leader who took an assassin's bullet April 4th, 1968. Let's go to Al. Al has a question or comment.
Yes, Michael, good afternoon. I wanted to ask you a question about did you see it as hypocrisy on the part of President Obama, considering that Martin Luther King, he was diametrically against the Vietnam War,
right.
The CIA and FBI, they assassinated him, and then they moved on 50 years forward. Then but before that, he received the Nobel Peace Prize for peace. So then how, I was trying to, come up with some type of understanding, how could the individuals in charge of the Nobel Peace Prize give it to Obama when Obama assassinated and killed more Muslims in the Arab world than George Bush and his father? So I just thought that was, hypocrisy.
All right. Thank you so much, Al. There's quite a lot in there. In fact, the debate erupted when the Norwegian Nobel Committee decided to give Barack Obama, former President Barack Obama, the Nobel Peace Prize. I think he got it not even for it was not even.
He received it in 2009 before he had completed a full year in office.
Right, and there were lots of, because America was still involved in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and in the Middle East and so forth. And I think that debate was the debate came up, basically saying, Obama hasn't done much to show that in fact that he's pushing towards peace. And I think it is a Nobel acceptance speech, which you can play at another time. But for now, the spotlight is on Dr. King. I think Obama mentioned the contradictions of being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, asking in terms of what he's been able to do and so forth. But I think here's my take about that. I think the Norwegian Nobel Committee decided to give Obama the Nobel Peace Prize, not so much because he established a model of peace, but it was done in a way to influence this new presidency, which, of course, was a global political seismic shift, to walk towards peace. That was my take.
Well, I think there were two things. I think the point that you make, Bankalei, is true, is that they were looking at how they might influence this new presidency. But I also think they awarded him the Nobel Peace Prize based on the fact that here we had the first African-American president in the history of the United States. And I think they were looking at that as an act towards peace. When Dr. King...
Some sort of a resolution, if you will, to the race question in America.
Yes. Dr. King had been given the award in 1964, and here we now have... President Obama awarded it in 2009. I think basically it was recognizing not so much President Obama, but the United States and
the context of civil rights.
The context of the civil rights movement over those 40 years or so.
Right. Obama represents some sort of a settlement, if you will. Not a whole settlement, because folks will get angry and start calling in and say, Obama is not the final answer, but some sort of, a settlement, if you will, to the race question. And I think, Dr. King received it. And then, of course, Obama will go on to receive it decades later.
Well, it may well be that check mark non-sufficient funds in 1963 had come due, and there were funds enough in the bank to cover it.
All right, let's go back to Riverside Church. Here, Dr. King on the war in Vietnam. Take a listen.
Violence and militarism, unquote. If we continue, there will be no doubt in my mind and in the mind of the world that we have no honorable intentions in Vietnam. If we do not stop our war against the people of Vietnam immediately, the world will be left with no other alternative than to see this as some horrible, clumsy, and deadly game we have decided to play. The world now demands a maturity of America that we may not be able to achieve. It demands that we admit that we have been wrong from the beginning of our adventure in Vietnam, that we have been detrimental to the life of the Vietnamese people. The situation is one in which we must be ready to turn sharply from our present ways in order to atone for our sins and errors in Vietnam. We should take the initiative in bringing a halt to this tragic war and set a date that we will remove all foreign troops from Vietnam in accordance with the 1954 Geneva Agreement. Part of our ongoing
that was a bold line in that speech, calling for the removal of all foreign troops. This was given by a non-elected official. Let's take a listen.
Part of our ongoing commitment might well express itself in an offer to grant asylum to any Vietnamese who fears for his life under the new regime, which included the Liberation Front. Then we must make what reparations we can for the damage we have done. We must provide the medical aid that is badly needed, making it available in this country if necessary. Meanwhile,
Dr. King asking for reparations for the Vietnamese. Take a listen.
Meanwhile, we in the churches and synagogues have a continuing task while we urge our government to disengage itself from a disgraceful commitment. We must continue to raise our voices and our lives if our nation persists in its perverse ways in Vietnam. We must be prepared to match actions with words by seeking out every creative method of protest possible. These are the times for real choices and not false ones. We are at the moment when our lives must be placed on the line if our nation is to survive its own folly. Every man of humane convictions must decide on the protest that best suits his convictions, but we must all protest. Now, that is something seductively tempting about stopping there and sending us all off on what in some circles has become a popular crusade against the war in Vietnam. I say we must enter that struggle, but I wish to go on now to say something even more disturbing. The war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. And if we ignore this sobering reality, we will find ourselves organizing clergy and layman concerned committees for the next generation. They will be concerned about Guatemala and Peru. They will be concerned about Thailand and Cambodia. They will be concerned about Mozambique and South Africa. We will be marching for these and a dozen other names and attending rallies without end, unless there is a significant and profound change in American life and policy.
The interesting thing about this, Bill, is that all the nations that Dr. King mentioned, the U.S. has had involvement in all of them, perhaps in Cambodia, well documented. But perhaps among the most prominent also is South Africa, the apartheid movement. At that time, in 1967, of course, Nelson Mandela had just been sent to prison to later serve on 27 years. And the U.S. involvement in the South African apartheid system, we remember the divestment movements here in the United States, but also this sort of a protective policy, if you will, by the Reagan administration at the time for the South African government. And this kind of engagement that the United States had with South Africa, which almost was one that was like babysitting apartheid, not really knocking it down, not rebuking it openly, but babysitting apartheid here and there. And it's interesting, Dr. King would mention these nations He dies the following year, takes an assassin's bullet, and those nations will go into flames.
And well, just referring back to the South African
Election.
situation
Right.
and apartheid, it's interesting that the U.S. government continued to support South Africa in many respects. Even South Africa's quote-unquote mother country, Great Britain,
Right.
stepped away from South Africa.
Right.
But we move into the Reagan years in 1981 and beyond, and the Reagan administration is still supporting the apartheid regime of South Africa. And we see the protests that Dr. King referred to in this speech occur relative to South Africa over the course of the next 20 years. Which eventually led to Mandela's freedom and
Right.
which led to the abolition of the apartheid regime.
Right.
But that wasn't the result of governmental action so much as it was the result of good people saying, we will not stand for this anymore.
Right. Time to break silence, as Dr. King said in the Vietnam speech. Let's go to Abdallah. Abdallah has a question or comment.
Well, I have a comment because I just heard something. Me being a man, 88 years old, and within the World War II, and it's a lot of understanding I can give people who don't have. And he's talking about Obama. See, every president that's ever been in there, all of them supposed to, but the one you got in now, that have advised, and they give him some poor advisement about Brother Muammar Gaddafi, about that country and everything. But this is the thing that happened in that case. He tried to do Obama. I voted for him too. He tried to do things that all of the people, not just no one color. He was the president of all the people. And the thing that he did, that was wrong. He did some wrong things when he was in there. But he did the right thing when he had Bin Laden. Because Bin Laden really was the one who was put together to go against them people over in the Middle East. See, like 9/11. Once you get to 9/11, they wouldn't be about it. All of it was put together.
Yeah, well, not only 9/11, there was also... No, you're right. I think not only 9/11, but there was also the bombings in Kenya, the U.S. embassies in Eastern Africa. Go ahead, Abdullah.
Yeah. So it's having to understand, baby. You know, when I was in World War II, people over there, they used to tell us that we're not y'all enemy. Why y'all over here is fighting and killing our children and saying that we love y'all? You can date our women and all that stuff. So that you look at one of their women, they'll kill you. You know, that's during the time when this boy that they killed put in the river. And there was, it's a lot, like I said, but this is what I want people to know. It wasn't a lot of things that Obama did weren't right. And but he took his advice from some of the advice. Yeah. Donald Trump, can't nobody advise him on nothing. Which I know you guys are small, alliance guys, you know that. And thank you for taking my call.
No problem. Let's go back to River.